Hello, and welcome to the Content Advantage, a talk show about content for content professionals. I'm Scott Abel, and with me today is my co-host, Megan Gahuli. Hello, Megan. How are you today? Can you hear me? Yes, you
Can you
can.
hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes. Okay, very good.
Yeah.
Very good. I wasn't sure. Today I have a wonderful guest, and I'd like to introduce him. His name is Ray Walsh. Ray is an American that's been living in Prague for 12 years, I believe you said, and he is the author of a fabulous book called Localizing Employee Communications, a Handbook. So welcome, Ray. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. Is everything okay? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great.
Loud
We
and
can.
clear.
And if the internet gods are on our sides, we'll continue to hear you for 30 minutes. You never know in these days.
You don't.
But thanks for joining us. And before we jump into the interview with Ray, let me tell our audience, especially those of you who are new to the program, a few things. First of all, don't worry, we can't see you or hear you. So we have no access to your camera or your microphone. So you can look or feel or sound however you like and be comfortable just like you're watching television. And speaking of television, just like television, today's show is being recorded. So if you need to duck out early, or if you'd like to share this program with somebody else at the end of the day, you may. About 30 minutes after the show ends today, the link that you're using to watch the live show will become a link to the recording that you can share with others, and we hope that you do. Also, you can ask a question at any time by using the Ask a Questions tab located in your webinar viewing panel. It allows you to text a question in to Megan and I, and we'll be aware that you've done so, and with time remaining, and if we can slip it into the conversation in a natural way, we'll try to get your question answered by Ray as well. And you can access additional content located in the attachments section of your webinar viewing panel, including some handouts provided by our sponsor and also by today's guest. And there's some troubleshooting information and some additional marketing information and contact information for all of us should you need to reach out to us after the program's over for any reason. And if you've got ideas for upcoming guests that you think would be great on the show, or if you'd like us to cover a topic, feel free to send us an email at info@thecontentwrangler.com, or you can use the attachments and links sections questions feature to do the same thing. All right, without any further delay, Megan, why don't we dive right into today's topic, and you can start off by asking the first question.
Absolutely. So first, I'd just like to start with kind of an easy one. How did you get into information development, and more specifically, what's your tie to internal communication?
I've been in communication fields. I'm a writer, but I've been in those fields for about 20 years. And I moved to Europe 12 years ago, and over time, I've developed more of a specialty in internal communications. And sitting in conference rooms here in Europe, I'm usually in what's a region office, or the headquarters is in the U.S. or some other country. And sometimes I'm in those conference rooms on the conference call, and I'm sensing a lack of understanding between the parties. Even though the English is at a high level, there's just some little gaps, and the Americans aren't understanding the Europeans and vice versa.
Okay.
And then a few years later, I first came across the word, I understood the word localization because we used it in our company. But then I understood that there was an industry called localization. And I started to do research to find out what could we in internal communications learn from the localization industry to apply to our practices. And that started a ball rolling that eventually turned into a book put out by Content Wrangler called Localizing Employee Communications.
Excellent. So you mentioned a couple of words that a few of our folks who are watching today might have that same experience, where they nod their head in agreement, but maybe not know exactly what we're talking about. So just for clarity, could you tell the audience members, what do you mean by localization? And what do you mean when you say that we might want our employees and internal stakeholders to be co-creators of content or trans-creators of content?
The language industry would probably use localization to imply, at least in part, adapting of content for language and culture.
Right.
In internal communications context, I would hope that's the case. That would be an ideal case, but it isn't always necessarily going to be true. For example, here in Prague, we have a big category of employers that have shared service centers, call centers, financial transaction processing, IT support. And in those offices, you might have people speaking 20 or 30 different languages, a younger demographic, but it's not just a check office.
Sure.
So in that context, it might not be practical to localize for 20 different languages.
Right.
Again, one day maybe technology will get us there where we can individualize, but right now that might be impractical. Nevertheless, you can provide very specific local references that make that content or make that information more meaningful to the recipients. For example, what does that financial accountant understand about the growth strategy or the sales strategy, and how can that accountant support it? You see a lot of, because that accountant may be ignoring the global content, you see a lot of examples of them just not being in tune with what the company's talking about on a global level. So localizing in that context would be, how do you team members support these global initiatives?
So how do you adapt the content so that it's relevant for the person where they find themselves today in their current environment, with their current understanding, languages, rules, all the things that surround the humans that we have to work with? What attracted you to the topic of internal communications? You said you were a communicator by education. What kind of made you go that direction?
I was a journalist formerly, and I guess it was just a job break. It was just a job break. It was the internet bubble, and I got my first corporate job at the age of 36. Sure. My friends in marketing, my friends in PR, they tend to think of us as the poor stepchild of communications. They just think that internal must be just you're writing emails all the time. Right. The reason I like it is because it is really, you are more the newsroom for the company, and you're getting a perspective both from the executive level and what they want people to understand, but we're also kind of that grassroots, what are we hearing from the field and what's not actually percolating all the way down.
I love that
interesting
newsroom example.
Yes, very, very much. We both love it because we both came out of journalism. So that's
right.
Awesome. So I have to say there's an interesting thing here. I was in Prague one and only one time. And the one time I was in Prague, I got kicked out of a grocery store. And it freaked me out.
Really?
And the reason, I had no idea. This guy just came over and started yelling at me in Czech. And I, was ushered out, and I got out, and I was like, why did I get kicked out? Do they really hate Americans? Like, what was it? Did I look like an American? I don't know. And it turns out,
you have a lot of rules.
Yes, they do. And it turns out I got kicked out because I hadn't gotten a buggy on the way in. If you don't get a buggy, they can't count how many people are in it, and therefore you get kicked out. I didn't know this. This was a rule that I wish would have been localized. I mean, for me, I was in their locale, so they had it all in check. But these are there are always these rules that we deal with. But ultimately, what is the problem with internal communication? Like, are these the same problems that we face with external communications? Are there additional problems that internal communication folks face?
I think the biggest problem, most of us coming from journalism background, we tend to get that endorphin rush from clicks on our content. So we tend to be content focused, and we think that every organizational problem can be fixed with an article or a tweet or something. And I don't want to say that our work isn't important, but I think when you're really looking at organizational optimization, that kind of thing, I think it's a lack of alignment, and very often that lack of alignment has to do with communication breakdown. And in researching localization, what I'm increasingly convinced of is maybe our channels, the journalists, the former journalists, maybe our channels aren't as important as we think. People aren't reading our internet articles. People aren't interpreting them correctly and understanding what the strategy means for them. So I think there is definitely a camp in the internal communications field, and I'm in that camp, where maybe our most effective channel are the managers themselves. And we need them to translate these big global ideas into team level and sometimes individual level pieces of information. And in some countries, I think you'd see they'd actually be doing also the literal translation into another language and adapting to the culture. But I think that there's maybe a number of ways to do that. But I am interested in how can we as communications professionals empower those managers to interpret the company story.
Sure, and the three of us are, in tune with this topic, so we know why this is important. But how would an organization that thinks they're doing a pretty good job know if they have a need to address their internal corporate communications? In other words, they might know something's wrong, but how do they know that it's the communications that are wrong? I think you have a couple of pain points that you've seen that you believe are common to organizations that are suffering with these challenges.
I think even the best global organizations or multinational organizations have some areas of dysfunction. And I think that co-creation, localization, they're inherently collaborative processes. And I think if you apply those principles of localization, it may help you explore where is the breakdown, where is it happening? Is it on a personal level? Is it just that our content isn't clear? Is it that they don't really access our channel? Where is it breaking down exactly? So I think it's basically an exploratory method at first. And yes, I do think that there are some common pain points. And I can quickly jump into those, but one specific example might be safety performance. I had a client, a plastics company, headquartered in Europe, production facilities in the Americas, Asia, and in Europe. And the top executive's message was safety is and sustainability our number one concern. And yet they kept having accidents in Asia, and it got to be quite embarrassing. And it's where is this coming from? And so the more they talk about it, the more they communicate about it, they're not actually having an impact on the problem. And in this specific example, I would say that would be an opportunity to really go in and talk to local leadership, local management. Why is this happening? Is there anything that our communications can do to help? Or is there something we're doing that's not helping specifically?
So you're saying that it might not be that if safety is what they thought the problem was, it might not be a safety thing. It might be the way they're communicating about safety that's causing the confusion that leads to the undesirable results.
I think this is where journalism, mentality really helps. Like, is it that local managers are pushing more of a speed or a cost thing, and maybe they're, and maybe they're not really taking safety as the number one priority? Something is happening, and maybe it has nothing to do with communications. Maybe it has everything to do with the amount of investment in the facility. But I think, if you're being that embarrassed externally that often, I think it's time to start finding out and talking to people.
Yeah,
I think you're right, though. If managers are goaling their employees on speed, but they're being held to safety standards, that's not an alignment, right? I mean, sure, you have to have speed and you have to have safety, but the goals have to make it clear. There has to be almost like a tension goal there, where you have to be fast, but you have to do it safely. And if you can set the right goals, that could lead up to that. But how can communication folks solve that problem?
I did interview one person for the book who told me, you can't do anything. It's
really?
It's an operational question. But then at the end of the interview, he came around and said, well, actually, if you can complement what management is doing, it can be great. And he's seen many instances of that. So I think it's, first of all, we have to realize we can't solve the problem with an article, and we can't solve the problem with an executive video. And I think we need to talk to local managers. Well, I would advise first, in an instance like this, talk to local leadership. You don't want to come in like a hero and we can solve all of your problems. Talk to local leadership. Why is this happening? What do you think is happening? If they agree that communications has a role, then you go to the next level and identify some kind of stakeholder, somebody who's going to help you execute this. Could be an individual, maybe it's an outsourced vendor. In internal communications, probably it's going to be an internal resource. Now, in smaller countries especially, that's probably just going to be one person. And that person may not even come from a communications background. So then you need to provide them with the support, frequent collaboration, assets, resources, maybe even budget to really create communications. But I think, you're at this level, you're finding out, you're talking with that partner, with managers about what are you saying to people? Why isn't this communications working? And I think what they might say is, I need help with our daily talking points meeting. I don't know what to say to them about safety.
Ray, the four common pain points that you shared with us earlier were performance measures on a downward trend or something incongruent there. And that was the example you gave just a moment ago with safety. Some of the other ones you gave were behaviors are out of whack or incongruent with the company strategy. What did you mean by that one?
So I was thinking specifically of, sales targets. The company's talking about growth in certain key industries, and then in one country they're selling to some industry that they no longer want to support so much, or maybe it's a less profitable customer segment, and that's just for some reason they're not getting the message. And I think that's something that if it's happening, it's something to look for, and there may be a communications reason why.
How do you fix that if people aren't getting the message about global strategy? How would you go about fixing that? With content, of course.
Well, from a storyteller's perspective, you really want to inspire them. And I think most people do want to belong to something larger than themselves. So I'm just limited to my communications function. I can sing a good song, I can tell a good story, I can try to inspire them about all the great things our company is doing, and then give them the practical information about what they need to do, to the best that I can. But I think, if you're really talking about people selling the wrong products and that kind of thing, you also have to look at incentives. It's probably the sales organization is just getting paid to sell whatever, and they haven't put that into their payroll. We in communications, there may not be much we can do about that, but we can use our storytelling skills to really at least persuade people that there are good customer segments and not so good customer segments.
You also warned that there's sometimes a warning sign when employees might ignore things like compulsory training. Can you explain what you mean by that?
So I think there's a couple of ways to tackle this, but I'm thinking of that annual training you have to do on IT security or harassment or anti-bribery and corruption. It's usually an annual event, and employees tend to find it annoying, fairly pandering or condescending.
Like
and they
feel like complication.
And there's it's just nobody really likes this exercise, to be honest. But I think that there are two areas that localization can really help. Number one, if you really need to get your employee participation up to 100%, and that usually has to do with regulations or sustainability reports. But if that's your goal, I want 100% of our employees to take this training, localization can speed up the process and the nag factor considerably, if it's just an easier experience.
Is that because when we solidify our training, the compulsory training we want everybody to take, we consider it done when it communicates well in our own language with the own people who helped create it? Then we launch it and we give it to other places and it falls flat. And could you give us an example of why why would something like sexual harassment training not just be universally acceptable?
I think that's a great question, and I think that's it depends on the company. What's your goal here? Do you want 100% to take the core training, or do you actually want to get results? And if they want to get results, I think that's also another strong argument for localization. Here in Central Europe, something like sexual harassment or the Me Too movement, you hear a lot of guys saying this is just a silly American thing. It's a silly overreaction to an American problem that we don't have here. Now, I can assure you, in Central Europe, they have sexual harassment problems, and these guys need to learn a little bit more about the way the world works today. But I think if you're going to persuade them, you need to speak to them and their culture and where they are now. If you come at it from an American perspective, they're just going to reject it from the beginning. This is a nonsense exercise that I have to go through for corporate, and I'm just going to do it as quickly as I possibly can.
One thing I noticed at a very large company that I worked for is that we had these trainings, and one would come from InfoSec, and one would come from legal, and one would come from IT, and they'd have all the same information on it. But it really was a matter of they needed 100% participation. They didn't really measure the results at all. So what ended up happening is you go through it and you're like, I swear I did this already. And you'd write back to someone, they'd say, no, we show that you haven't. And I'm like, but I did. It just came from a different place, right? But it's the same material. So I think some of it is just a matter of having a common communication team to push all of this training through, so you know that each person is getting the right training at the right time and not getting bombarded with the same training over and over and over again. Is that true?
I would love to see that.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
But companies go through mergers and they have two different IT departments, and there's a lot of organizational reasons why this is happening. Some companies are getting somebody in charge of employee experience, and there's somebody overseeing this, and that's a very good trend. Somebody needs to be thinking about how often are these trainings coming down the pipeline, because they often crash into each other. It's a very common.
This sounds like the last pain point you had mentioned is kind of a summary of it. Really, is you said that sometimes global company content that's perceived as being produced by headquarters are not always given the attention that you would want at local offices, but it's because it was produced at the global company level. So what are you getting at there?
So many employees have told me on a daily basis, they just don't go to the intranet. They don't think they have time for it. They don't think it's relevant to them. And most intranets are one language. And the companies that I've worked for, it's usually English is in the communications department, of course. They wouldn't hire me if I wasn't an English speaker. So they don't go to the internet, and they look at these emails, and unless it's very short and easy, they just realize that they can ignore it because it's not specific to their task today.
Got it.
It basically flagged itself as this is a corporate communication, and it's and then they ignore it, and then nothing bad happens, and then they get a reminder, and they ignore that, and it just never seems that pressing or urgent to them as, for example, an email from their boss.
So how do communications folks add into their strategy something that will help solve that problem?
Good question.
I think the local advocate has to be there. It's not so much the email or the article that we wrote, that's so important to us, but how do we get managers to talk about that in their meeting? Did you see the article about the big healthcare win? What does that mean for us? How can we support this new client? Is there, is the onboarding something that but that is a persuasion piece. How do you persuade managers to sing your song? So I think our content, which is often considered to be the lead or big announcement, and then maybe we do a follow-up article, but more or less we're on to the next campaign. I think there should be follow-up for who are your local advocates to really make sure that this is talked about, and
Right.
if you're using enterprise social, shared, because if it's coming from me in corporate communications, they just don't think it's that important.
This is a good time to remind the audience members who are watching that they can ask a question at any time using the Ask a Question tab located in your webinar viewing panel. It's also a great time for us to mention that today's show is sponsored by Zoom Software, which luckily we have a representative from on the show today. Megan, can you tell our audience a little bit about what Zoom Software does and how it could help them tackle some of these content challenges, like bringing the right piece of content to the right internal stakeholders?
Of course. So Zoom helps customers find answers that they need when and where they are. The platform ingests all of your product content and delivers it out to all of the sources where your customers are. But you can use the exact same thing by pushing it out to various locations or different portals within each location that could be localized. So there's definitely a way that we support this. So we're very excited to have you talk about this.
Excellent. Ray, can you give our viewers some tips for getting started before we run out of time today? Megan and I can dive deep in these subjects and get in the weeds, but I'd like to at least leave our audience members with a few things that they might be able to do to get started if they've recognized that, hey, some of these things sound familiar. Maybe we could do better work with our internal communication.
So one tendency might be to go direct to your local communicators that you've been working with and say, how can we solve this problem? But I would say, number one, start with the top leaders. Why, if you've identified any of these pain points, why do you think they're happening? And do you think that there's a communications, does communications play a role in solving it? And then if you don't already, the next step, and I think we already talked about this, but the next step would be to identify a local stakeholder who can help you get the message out. Now, you probably have that in your biggest strategic markets, but you may not have it in your minor markets. So I'm thinking of countries like Germany and China. It's a big market.
Oh, yeah.
Some support there. But if you don't know them personally, get in touch with them and start a relationship, because that's really important. I've seen so many campaign rollouts where they get the call together and it's like, okay, on Tuesday, you're going to get these PDFs and then we need you to implement them. And the article goes live Wednesday. And then the person's on the call say, do you have any German translations or do you have any Chinese? And this was in pharma companies, and they really strongly asserted everybody speaks English. This is a high-tech environment. But, and it was actually, in this case, they were rolling out a expense reimbursement system. And the Germans and the Chinese said, you absolutely have to have translations if you want people to adopt this thing. So the people that do the localization, that do the communicating locally, get in contact with them and communicate with them frequently about what you have coming. Just get on the calendars and talk well in advance. Don't call them on Tuesday for something that has to go out Wednesday. Yeah. And then the last thing I would say is just maintain that relationship over the long term. and get them visual assets they can use easily. They can adapt easily. They can change the language if they need to. You don't need to spend a lot of money on this. You just need to give people things that are flexible that they can work with and have that dialogue with them about what's working and what's not.
So who are these stakeholders that you need to get involved with at the local level? Are we talking VPs? Are we talking, someone at your level?
It depends on the size of the country, the size of the market, the culture of the organization. That's why I would urge to start at the leadership level. But what I've seen very often is the people that actually do the communication, send the thing or, process it somehow and send it on to everybody in their country. They're very often a borrowed resource. They're from HR and they're doing this as a favor, or they're from marketing and they're doing this as a favor. And they don't really have a lot of time for you. They just want to get it out of the way. So that's why building the relationship is so important and really convincing them that it's worth their time. So, it really depends. But to your point, in some smaller markets, it might be like the chief executive of that country. So you're really working with a whole variety of people if it's a large global organization.
I think you've made a good point that not all companies operate the same, not all organizations have the same needs or sizes or budgets, etc. But it seems like most people who create content for these organizations were still schooled, despite living in different countries, on the basics, right? We need clear, concise, relevant content. It needs, know your audience and the intent of your communication. And so all these trends that we see changing the way that we work is there any trend toward creating internal communication with the same respect and diligence as we do with external communication? I mean, I've seen a lot of budget dollars go to external communication, and I wonder if we just skip over that. There's not a box on the budget for internal communication. It's just kind of is that true, or do you think there's
the trend is maybe we can integrate communications and we can take some of that expense that we're spending on customers and just share them with employees too, and that's a really good thing to do. I would encourage that. But coming from a content background, it's so frustrating when you're looking at measurement and you're writing this exquisitely composed content and timing it well and giving it different visuals, and then it runs next to a story in France about it was somebody's birthday and here's the cake and here's the terrible blurry photo with a timestamp on it, and that piece of content gets 3 times the clicks of your
right.
So yeah, it's very frustrating, but it's a sad reality. So I think we in the communications department, we need to work with the people creating the happy birthday content and see if we can up their game a bit. And what kind of assets can we provide them? They probably just don't have resources the same that we do in corporate headquarters, and really get them to understand what a call to action is or why they should maybe cross post in various channels. We do know stuff, but I just think we need to maybe quiet down a bit and help others do the communicating.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And so Zuman's a global company. We're based both in Israel and the US, but we have customers everywhere. And so I see a lot of, differences in the culture between here and Israel. And I'm just thinking about what a big job that would be to try and figure out how do you say happy birthday in 27 different countries or 50 different countries, right? That's a big job. So how does a communication person start diving into that enormous job?
I think it was John Juncker was writing about getting global awareness is really important, but it's a life's work, and no one person or no one department can be fully aware of all these global cultures and where you're offending people, and that's why I urge people to really start a relationship with local people, if not the local communicator in each market. Try to be as aware as you can, of course. But also, there's a lot of missteps that corporate does where they create like a Christmas box and it's got all kinds of different languages to say Merry Christmas. And they've just got nonsense translations in there because people don't say Happy Holidays in Czech Republic and Poland.
Right. Yeah. Those are things you know about.
Yeah. It's really interesting to me because I've dealt with this before where someone has said something to a customer and English is not their first language, and therefore they end up saying something that would offend an American, and you have to then have a little bit of, I found that I need to have empathy, not only for the customer, but also for the folks who are using a second language. I don't really, I mean, I pretend to speak a couple languages, but I don't speak any of them at all, really. So I don't really understand how they're feeling, but I have enough empathy to be able to go back to them and say, look, I know you didn't mean to say this. I think it's a language barrier, but here's how it comes across. And then go back to the customer and say they didn't mean it, you know. And so really having that empathy and not just assuming that somebody was being mean because they said the wrong words when it's their second language. Have you seen that?
I've seen it in my life. I mean, I was an English teacher way back in my 20s in this part of Europe again, and you see those situations in life all the time. People taking offense. I haven't seen it so much on the job. I think people are pretty professional about these things.
Or maybe they're
ignoring my American. My American colleagues can sometimes be a bit unforgiving. And I think they also maybe are, and I would include the English in this, by the way, but I think they can be a bit quick to laugh. And, you know, and I think that doesn't really help with the, just the atmosphere, the collaborative, the globally collaborative atmosphere that you're trying to develop. I think everybody needs to learn a bit more tolerance for those kinds of mistakes.
Absolutely.
One of our viewers asked if we would repeat the name of the person that that we mentioned earlier, and that was John Yunker, spelled Y-U-N-K-E-R. He is a kind of a famous person in the translation industry. He's written a book called Think Outside the Country, A Guide to Going Global and Succeeding in the Translation Economy. If you were to just Amazon or Google him, John Yunker, you find some additional content from him. There's a bunch of reports that he puts out every year where they try to bring together the best practices and wisdom from translation and localization. And he often talks about things that Ray is interested in as well. So you've got some good resources there. Ray, can you recommend any other resources for people who are serious about trying to figure out how to solve some of these problems?
Yeah, I think it's, you know, nobody likes to spend a lot of money on internal communications. That's one of the reasons why they're doing it all in English. And I think John's book is quite persuasive. And I think that, you know, people could use that to help argue for more budget or more, you know, just slowing down the processes and thinking more carefully about how things are executed. Another one is Anna Schlegel's book on basically building a localization department. I found it incredibly informative for, you know, this is how, you know, the things that she argues for, I would just change a couple of words to make the same argument for reaching employees. But there's a lot of managers, a lot of mid-level managers up to the C-suite that don't really understand what it means to really operate a global company.
Yeah, Scott, we have to get on a show.
Yes, Anna Schlegel will be on a show in the future, and she's going to be talking about her book, Truly Global. And for those of you who want to Google her, Anna is A-N-N-A, and then Schlegel, her last name is S-C-H-L-E-G-E-L. And even if you just typed in Anna and Truly Global, you'll probably pull her up because she's everywhere talking about this subject. She's a leader at NetApp and a great communicator. So we'll have her on a show in the future. Thanks for bringing up that and recommending her as well.
Of course, I have to say my book, the first part of the book is explaining the problem about what, you know, so companies that say we do it all in English, everybody here speaks English, and that may be true to a point, but I think there are still areas of breakdown that you may not be aware of. And that's what I've outlined in the first part of the book.
And you've written for us a fabulous article that is in the resources that we have here that is very clear and concise. Is that kind of a preview of your book, would you say?
Yeah, I think that's one of the, you know, those are portions of part one that are showing these are areas of breakdown where communications can help support and and find solutions.
Yes, so for those audience members that are wondering, what are they talking about? In the attachments and links section of your webinar viewing panel, if you were to click on that little area, you'll be able to find documents available that you could download or link to from the web. And one of them is provided by our presenter today. It's called 4 Signs That Your Organization Needs Internal Localization and Co-Creation. It's got some great tips in there to help you start thinking about how you might tackle these problems and communicate with them to people in your organization that need to know, like your management and the partners that you might have to interact with. So Ray, thanks for bringing this up. I think it's a great topic. Let's see if there's anything else here. One of our readers says this is not just or viewers, set of skills that most people have the chance to reach in their lifespan. So thank you for talking about it. So we've got some fans already out there. You're not alone.
Good. That's always good to hear.
Yes, very good. All right. Somebody else actually wrote in and said that, I'm sorry to say, I think there's a limited set of skills on global companies. I think that's probably true, but there are a lot of global companies, so we need to turn that around, apparently.
Yeah, well, maybe it's not that there's a limited set. Maybe it's that there's so many skills and they're so diverse and they're scattered amongst the company.
Yeah.
It's hard to bring them all back together, and that this is one good way for people to start to think about what can we do that's practical that helps us better communicate.
Yeah, and I think what Ray brought up as far as tolerance is key there.
And
nobody is ever going to have 100% of the skills. Be tolerant of that, understand that, have empathy, and help them out.
Excellent. Well,
I also find that the business world, they have a lot of skills and very specialized knowledge, but what we consider to be basic communication skills are often not there at all. And I think the business world could at least open itself up to the idea that maybe the way you communicate something, and that there may be better ways than just, I don't know, flipping the PowerPoint to the whole team and saying, read this.
Exactly. Well, thanks. It looks like we're out of time. So Megan and I would like to thank you, Ray, for joining us and making time to be on our show today. We really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and your wisdom with our audience, and especially the tips on how to get started. And thanks to our audience for being there. We appreciate your watching the show, and we hope that you'll share the recording link. So about 30 minutes from now, you can use the same URL you're using to watch today's show to share with other people, and they'll be able to watch the show on demand whenever they like. So thanks for being here, and thanks, Ray. We really appreciate your time today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Ray. It was really, really fun talking to you about this. This is a really interesting subject. Just want to say before you go to the audience, use the Rate This tab in your viewing panel. Give us a 1 to 5 star rating. Leave us any comments. We love to get the comments. We like to hear what we need to improve. We like to hear what you liked. Anything you have to say, just go ahead and stick it in the Rate This tab in the comment section.
Excellent. And before you go, I encourage you to be on the lookout in your inbox, your email inbox, for your next invitation, which will come to the Content Advantage Show Tuesday, September the 29th, our next show, when we chat with Tim Hayden about the need for information developers to work toward building direct and personalized customer experiences. That show promises to be a good one. So anyone with a concern about customer experience, you definitely want to dial in for that one. Until we see you again, be careful, be safe, and be well, and keep doing good work. Thanks for joining us on today's show. I appreciate it. Till we see you again, stay safe. Bye-bye.
Bye. Ensure your customers find the answers they need with Zoomin. Bring together product content from all teams and sources to deliver a unified, personalized content experience. Check us out at www.zoominsoftware.com.